many inaccuracies and distortions. As one sympathetic editor of Burke exclaimed, after praising Burke for his profound insights, if only his facts had been correct. Burke's unreliable account of the French Revolution was remarked upon by many critics. Thomas Paine, for example, crucified Burke on this issue, and he devoted a major portion of Rights of Man to setting the record straight. A French admirer of Burke, who was close to the political scene, tried to break the bad news to Burke in a diplomatic way. This Frenchman feared Burke's errors would be seized upon by critics and used to undermine his entire book.
As a token of my sincerity, sir, I hope you will receive some few remarks I'll take the liberty to offer you. I have been sorry to find you have been mistaken in some facts, because the enemies of good order shall cavil on those slight faults to be met with in your work, to keep the eyes of my countrymen from the masterly strokes by whom you so vividly expose the raw and rash undertaking of these prentice bricklayers of ours, in erecting that noblest of all buildings, so very much above their skill and ability, the constitution of a great state. To men of candor, such slight errors would be nothing. To our enemies, to the enemies of order, of government, of religion, of everything that is valuable, they will afford a handle to disparage in the eyes of an ignorant multitude one of the finest compositions of the age.
If Reflections is less than a reliable chronicle of the French Revolution, and if it is more than an assault on democratic ideals, then where is its value? What are the lasting themes and arguments in this famous book? Moreover, did Burke, as critics claimed, shift his ground between the time of the American and French Revolutions? Or did his different judgments simply reflect an application of the same principles to different circumstances? We shall turn to this question first. Then we can tease out the basic themes contained in Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. The critics of Edmund Burke, including fellow members of Parliament, accused Reflections of betraying his liberal principles of earlier days. Burke denies this. His critics are running in circles around him, Burke says, and only from their unstable vantage point does he appear to change. Here, Burke refers to himself in the third person.
The author of that book is supposed to have passed from extreme to extreme, but he has always kept himself in a medium. This charge is not so wonderful. It is in the nature of things that they who are in the centre of a circle should appear directly opposed to those who view them from any part of the circumference. In that middle point, however, he will still remain, though he may hear people who themselves run beyond Aurora and the Ganges cry out that he is at the extremity of the West.
Just because he sympathized with one revolution, Burke argues, does not mean he should sympathize with all revolutions.
Is it for this reason, or for anything he has said or done relative to the American war, that he is to enter into an alliance offensive and defensive with every rebellion, in every country, under every circumstance, and raised upon whatever pretense?
Burke supported the Americans because, in his opinion, they were defending their ancient liberties against British encroachment. In his words to fellow Britons, the Americans were purely on the defensive in that rebellion. They had taken up arms from one motive only, that is, our attempting to tax them without their consent. This is the essential difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The Americans were not radical innovators. They did not uproot their old society and government and attempt to fashion new ones from the thin air of abstract principles. French revolutionaries, on the contrary, were demolishing the social and political foundations of the Ancien Regime, the old order. Equality of citizenship replaced class distinctions. Church lands were nationalized, and alarming fiscal experiments were implemented. French revolutionaries, unlike American revolutionaries, wished to tear down their ancient institutions and rebuild from the ground up. Unable to cope with the complexities of needed reform, the French looked for simplistic and dangerous solutions, as Burke put it in his Reflections, addressing a Frenchman.
It is this inability to wrestle with difficulty which has obliged the arbitrary Assembly of France to commence their schemes of reform with abolition and total destruction. But is it in destroying and pulling down that skill is displayed? Your mob can do this as well at least as your assemblies. The shallowest understanding, the rudest hand, is more than equal to the task. Rage and frenzy will pull down more in half an hour than prudence, deliberation, and foresight can build up in 100 years. The errors and defects of old establishments are visible and palpable. It calls for little ability to point them out. And where absolute power is given, it requires but a word, wholly to abolish the vice and the establishment together.
The policies of the French National Assembly, Burke contends, do not constitute true reform.
To make everything the reverse of what they have seen is quite as easy as to destroy. No difficulties occur in what has never been tried. Criticism is almost baffled in discovering the defects of what has not existed, and eager enthusiasm and cheating hope have all the wide field of imagination in which they may expiate with little or no opposition.
True reform is a complex and difficult process.
At once to preserve and to reform is quite another thing. When the useful parts of an old establishment are kept, and what is superadded is to be fitted to what is retained, a vigorous mind, steady persevering attention, various powers of comparison and combination, and the resources of an understanding fruitful in expedience are to be exercised. They are to be exercised in a continued conflict with the combined force of opposite vices, with the obstinacy that rejects all improvement, and the levity that is fatigued and disgusted with everything of which it is in possession.
True reform, Burke says, is also slow, so much the better.
But you may object, a process of this kind is slow. It is not fit for an assembly which glories in performing in a few months the work of ages. Such a mode of reforming possibly might take up many years. Well, without question it might, and it ought. It is one of the excellencies of a method in which time is amongst the assistants, that its operation is slow, and in some cases almost imperceptible. If circumspection and caution are a part of wisdom when we work only upon inanimate matter, surely they become a part of duty too when the subject of our demolition and construction is not brick and timber, but sentient beings, by the sudden alteration of whose state, condition, and habits multitudes may be rendered miserable.
This theme runs throughout the Reflections. Except in the most extreme emergencies, a condition, Burke says, not true of pre-revolutionary France, gradual reform is always superior to radical revolution. But what of Burke's claim that his defense of the Americans was essentially a conservative defense, that the Americans were justified because they wished to preserve the status quo? Did Burke really argue this during the 1770s, or did he manufacture this rationale later so as to appear consistent? Here, Burke was right, and his critics were wrong. Critics either forgot Burke's arguments, or they did not understand them. In this passage from Burke's Speech on American Taxation, delivered to Parliament in 1774, Burke's position is crystal clear. He did not appeal to abstract rights to justify his position, as did many American and British statesmen, Rather, Burke appealed to the ancient liberties of America, the rights Americans had traditionally enjoyed.
Again and again, revert to your old principles. Seek peace and ensue it. Leave America, if she has taxable matter in her, to tax herself. I am not here going into the distinctions of rights, not attempting to mark their boundaries. I do not enter into these metaphysical distinctions. I hate the very sound of them. Leave the Americans as they anciently stood, and these distinctions, born of our unhappy contest, will die along with it. They and we, and their and our ancestors, have been happy under that system. Be content to bind America by laws of trade. You have always done it. Let this be your reason for binding their trade. Do not burden them by taxes. You were not used to do so from the beginning. Let this be your reason for not taxing. These are the arguments of states and kingdoms. Leave the rest to the schools, for there only they may be discussed with safety.
It is hazardous, Burke argued, for the British to claim some abstract right based on sovereignty to tax the colonies. Why? Because this will open a Pandora's box. It will force the Americans to develop their own abstract theories of resistance, and the very foundation of British sovereignty will be jeopardized. Burke's insight on this subject was extraordinarily perceptive.
But if intemperately, unwisely, fatally, you sophisticate and poison the very source of government by urging subtle deductions and consequences odious to those who govern from the unlimited and illimitable nature of supreme sovereignty, you will teach them by these means to call that sovereignty itself in question. When you drive him hard, the boar will surely turn upon the hunters. If that sovereignty and their freedom cannot be reconciled, which will they take? They will cast your sovereignty in your face. Nobody will be argued into slavery.
We have seen how Edmund Burke distinguished the American Revolution from the French Revolution. The American Revolution was conservative. That is, it sought to conserve the traditional values and institutions of American society. The French Revolution, on the contrary, was radical. That is, it sought to overthrow the traditional values and institutions of French society. Supporters of the French Revolution regarded it as a watershed in the struggle to secure mankind's natural rights to life, liberty, and property. From the perspective of a Thomas Paine or a Thomas Jefferson, the French Revolution was an extension of principles first established in America, so they endorsed it enthusiastically. Burke, on the other hand, refuses to assess political events by the abstract standard of natural rights. This is a central feature of his approach, but it is sometimes misunderstood. Natural rights are said to exist in the nature of man, and their validity does not depend on law or government. Burke does not reject these rights completely, as is sometimes claimed. Significantly, when Burke marshals his famous arguments against rights, he usually calls them abstract rights instead of natural rights. When it came to natural rights, Burke occasionally had kind things to say, as we see from these remarks made 6 years before the French Revolution.
The rights of men, that is to say, the natural rights of mankind, are indeed sacred things, and if any public measure is proved mischievously to affect them, the objection ought to be fatal to that measure.
In Reflections, Burke insists he does not oppose the real rights of men, and some of these rights appear to be natural in the sense that they do not rely on the decree of governments. Burke contrasts these real rights with the supposed abstract rights of French revolutionaries.
Far am I from denying in theory, full as far is my heart from withholding in practice, if I were of power to give or to withhold the real rights of men. In denying their false claims of right, I do not mean to injure those which are real, and are such as their pretended rights would totally destroy. If civil society